Hey guys, what is happening? Today we're going to be doing a mix of a new PC and an old PC build, really an upgrade to my freeNAS box. I've been using freeNAS for quite a few years now. I really like freeNAS. I store all my media on it. It's a good, stable program. It's got built-in ZFF file system now, works really well. But basically, the PC that I'm using for it has an ugly case, an ugly, noisy, hot case with I believe it has a Core i5 750, an older Core i5 processor. I want to get that out of there, get something a little bit cooler, something a little more energy efficient in there, and basically have an improved case. So I'm going to go over the parts that we have for this build today. Some of the parts are new, some are going to be used from the previous build. Mainly, I think I'm just keeping the hard drives primarily from the current build, but we'll go over what I decided to put into this machine. Alright, so from a new parts perspective, we have the Antec P100 case. This is a pretty nice and relatively affordable case. It should do well with cooling. It has provisions for all the fans we need, including, if I wanted to, a radiator. I believe it's a 240 millimeter radiator, a double 120. But we're not going to be doing any water cooling with this. It's not going to be needed. In fact, I'm not even going into anything but the spare, with the stock cooler for this Intel Celeron G530 processor. This is an older processor, but I've used them a lot. I actually bought a bunch of these at once, so this is new old stock, I guess you could say. I have a few of these lying around. I also am going to be going with, here's just an extra case fan from, matches the fans that are currently in the system. Our power supply is this Corsair CX500. It doesn't need a huge power supply. Not going to be running any sort of graphics on this. It's going to be a headless machine, so it's just going to have whatever inboard graphics are built into this, which is a motherboard to go with that particular processor. It's a Gigabyte B75M-D3H. I have quite a few of these too. I bought like 3 or 4 of them and matching Celeron processors that I use for these kind of lightweight server builds. Now, FreeNAS actually does need, more important than the processor when you're building a FreeNAS machine for the ZFS file system, is memory. So we're going with 16 gigabytes of memory for this system. Currently I have it running with 8, and it's pretty much maxing out its memory, so I wanted to double the memory. The processor's never been above 20% usage, so I'm not worried about the processor. I am worried about the memory. This here is just a replacement Western Digital red hard drive. I'll open that later. Right now it has all green hard drives in it. There's 6 2-terabyte green hard drives. One of them is starting to show some bad sectors, so I want to get that replaced, get the RAID out of degraded state. And then for every machine that I build, I generally put in an Intel network interface card rather than use the onboard. You get better transfer rates. I love the Intel Pro Gigabit Internet card, so I'm going to go ahead and put one of those in this machine as well. So that takes care of all of the basic parts that we're going to be utilizing for this build. I am going to be reusing 5 of those Western Digital green hard drives for now. They're still working, so I'm going to use them until they die, and as they die I'm going to replace them with the reds, which are built for network attached storage devices, so it's a nice thing for the future. But for now, let's go ahead and get this case unboxed and we can get the motherboard and CPU set up. Alright, so what we've got here is, like I said, an Antec P100 case. It's really very similar to the 280 in most respects. I think the major difference is that it has 7 3.5-inch bays inside instead of 6. It's got this nice cover here. This is brushed aluminum. Well, I don't know. I think it's actually plastic, but it looks like brushed aluminum. Got our space for our 2 fans. It's really easy to get access to the fans behind that filter. Looking at the side here, got nice thumb screws, which I will set over here so I don't lose them. Alright, so inside the case, we've got these 7 toolless 3.5-inch drive bays. It's just a little caddy sled that you attach your drives to. Looks like just a piece of paper. Zip tied on here. Let's just get that off there real quick. So in the bag, we have your various screws, probably motherboard standoffs in there somewhere, longer screws for some of the fans, zip ties, and it includes 2 fans. They're both 120 millimeter. There's one in the front and one in the back. Up here at the top, there's room for a radiator, and I believe is there room on this case? No, there's not on the door any room for a fan, but we're going to be utilizing 2 in the front and the 1 in the back. I'm going to leave the radiator. There's a foam already in place here covering the holes. I'm going to leave those in place to keep the noise down. This is just going to be running a stock Celeron, so I don't anticipate heat being a big problem, but I do want to get a lot of cooling going for the fans up front here. So as you can see here, this is made for full-size boards, full-size ATX boards. So there are 7 expansion slots, input-output shield, and our space for our power supply down here. There's a lot of room to access the back side of the motherboard here, which is nice, and a decent amount of room for cable management. So we should be able to get all the cables tucked in here real nice and out of the way. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get the motherboard ready to go, put it in there. Alright, so I have my processor seated here. Let's go ahead and discharge the static. I don't wear a wrist strap. I've never really found the need. I've been doing this since like 1999, 1998, working with computers. I've never worn a wrist strap, and I've never fried anything yet. Knock on wood. MDF, but whatever. So I've got my processor seated. I've got the heatsink on. This is just the standard Intel heatsink that comes with this particular processor. It's not the greatest. If the noise becomes a problem, I will probably upgrade it. I've used these before. They're not that noisy. They're pretty decent. We have our 4 RAM slots here. We have a PCI Express slot here and here, and a couple of regular PCI slots. So this is actually a pretty decent motherboard. It's got 6 SATA ports, 2 SATA 3s, and 4 SATA 2s. Looking at the back here, we have regular VGA onboard audio, DVI, PS2, USB 3.0, the built-in Ethernet, which we won't be using, and it has built-in audio, which I also will not be using. And while we have everything handy here, I'm going to go ahead and install our memory. This is just Corsair XMS3 memory. I use this in a lot of my systems. It has the lower profile heat sink on it. It's not like the Vengeance or anything like that. Pretty much memory is memory, but this is one that I use a lot and I end up liking, so kind of stick to the similar parts for most of my builds. So it doesn't really matter that much which channels we put these in, but I'm going to put these 2 in the blue channels, since we're filling all 4 of the slots. It really doesn't matter. So installing memory is really simple. Let's go ahead and take it out of its little protective. Well, this is probably the hardest part. There we go. Take it out of its little protective sleeve here. If you look on the board, the board is keyed to match the memory. So there's a slot in the memory, there's a slot in the RAM slot. The 2 come together. You just push it in, and away you go. I kind of like to do this when it's not in the system, just because sometimes with cases it's a little hard to access things, so I usually mount the processor and all that while it's out. There are cases where you'll have plenty of room. This one probably wouldn't be a problem, but I figure why not do it where you can kind of see what I'm doing too here. So that nice little click means you're good to go. Got a couple more to do here. Now this file system, like I mentioned, that I'm using on FreeNAS, does utilize a lot of memory. So it was getting by with the 8 gigs of memory that I had in the previous system, but it was going to end up posing a problem at some point, because I had very little free available memory on the system. Memory's cheap. Just go ahead and go with 16 gigs. The general rule of thumb, I guess, is supposed to be you're supposed to use about 8 gigs plus a gig for every terabyte or something like that. I hear a lot of conflicting things about how much RAM you should really use, but just looking at how the system was performing, I think we'll be good with the 16. Alright, so we have our memory and our CPU good to go. So the board's pretty much ready to go into the system now. Alright, so for this part, I would just grab the CPU by the cooler here, like this. And what we want to do first is just make sure that our standoffs are lined up. Those are these little brass things in here. We do want to make sure that there aren't any that are going to touch the back of the board and short things out. It doesn't really matter if we have extras down here, because those aren't going to hurt anything. But does look pretty clearly like we're gonna have to move some stuff around here. So I'm gonna get these standoffs adjusted correctly for this board, and we'll be good to go. So, alright, so I adjusted the standoffs in the motherboard. I'm leaving these two in just so they go with this case. Basically what I always do here is I make sure that I count the number of holes that are in the motherboard where screws are meant to go through. So we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I know if I get 7 screws in, then everything's good. So I'm going to set this motherboard down here for a second. Now we need to put our I/O shield in, and usually this just goes in with the PS2 port at the top if it has a PS2 port. It just kind of gets pushed in. There's not a lot to it really. Alright, so now it's just a matter of taking the board, sliding it in. Some cases have a special standoff that sticks up a little bit that will hold the board in place. This one does not. So it's just a matter of kind of pushing it in, getting your screw lined up. And there we go. So I'll go ahead and get the rest of these put in, and we'll move on to the next step. Alright, so now it's time to deal with cable management. The board barely takes up any space in here, but I've routed my umbilicals for the front power buttons, the lights, USB, all that stuff back through the back side of the board. We're going to fish it through the front now and start hooking some of that stuff up here. So USB 3 I think is down at the bottom, so we'll pull that through there. All of our various switches and whatnot are going to be coming through the same grommet actually. And then what else do we have here? We have our audio. Is both audio? No, that's USB. That's audio. So I am going to probably hook up the audio, even though it's not going to be used. Actually, let's not hook up the audio. Pull the audio back out. We'll just manage that in the back. Now, I probably won't end up using all the USB ports either, but you never know. So we'll route those through. Now, as far as our switches go, they're all labeled. This is power switch and so forth. So what we need to do is find the corresponding marks on the board here. Most boards are labeled, not all are. This one's labeled pretty well, so I'm going to go ahead and get those plugged in here. Alright, so you can see the markings on the board there. The positives and negatives don't matter for anything with the LEDs. As far as switches go, they don't matter, so you can hook those up either way, but you do want to make sure you get the positives and negatives correct on the LEDs because they won't work otherwise. The power switch goes on just like that. So it's just a matter of doing this for the other switches, and then we'll be in good shape. So there we are with our cables connected. I'm not going to worry about cable management until we actually get everything in, and that way I can organize it a little bit better. There is no PC speaker built into this case, so I'm going to get one of the I have little standalone ones that I always put on if there isn't one built into the case, because I do like to have the post beep, especially on a server that's going to be running headless, so I know if it's posting correctly. So I'm going to find one of those and put that on as well. Alright, so we got our little speaker installed here, as you can see. Like I said, I just like to have that for diagnostic purposes on these boards. I wish most cases came with PC speakers now. It seems a lot of them don't. So we have USB 3 up here. This case comes with a little breakout cable on here, so if you only have USB 2 on your board, you can still utilize those front ports, but they will of course be in USB 2. But since we have USB 3, we're just going to go ahead and carefully plug that in. And it's snapped into place all nice. And then I think lastly we have a USB 2.0 header. We're going to go ahead and put that on the USB 1 port down here. The one that's labeled as USB 1 rather. Alright, so now it's time to install the second front case fan. We just pull this filter off. We have access to the fans here. So let's find the fan in my pile of stuff here. So this is the identical fan that came with the case pre-installed. This is an Antec Advanced True Quiet Pro 120. If I don't end up liking how these fans sound, I'll probably go with some Noctua fans for this, but I kind of wanted to see how it would work first. So it came with a little breakout cable for Molex power here. Looks like some quiet mounts, like the rubber mounts, and the fan unit itself. A little instruction booklet, which we'll promptly ignore. So I guess this is actually slightly different than the fan that's installed from the factory here. If you look at it, this one has different rubber mounts. It's actually a higher quality fan than what comes with the case. So we may end up replacing the built-in case fans because I don't know how quiet those are going to be. It looks like the blade design is even slightly different here, but we'll see how it goes. Alright, so we don't want to kill that thing. We just want to get it tight, and that should be better than those other mounts. I wasn't really feeling those other mounts, so I'm just putting the two in the corner like they did here. I'm not sure how I feel about this fan really and all, but we'll see. So we need to go ahead and get the power routed for this, which is going to take a second here to figure out exactly what we're going to do with that. Alright, so our next step is to install this 500 watt modular power supply. It's pretty basic. It has just the built-ins for the two we need, the 24 pin and the CPU connector, and then we have a couple of peripherals that we can add on as we need to. Those would be these cables here. It doesn't come with the usual bag that these come with, I guess just because it's a less expensive unit and there's not as many options here. So let's go ahead and get this thing set up. First we just gotta go pull this zip tie off. And do not eat this, apparently. I'm not sure this came with any screws of its own, so we'll find some screws to use for it. The case probably has some. So you just kind of position it, and let's find some screws. So these are just your kind of hex-headed screws. Now they aren't black, unfortunately. I would have preferred to have black screws to go with this, but I'll take what I got, I guess. Get all that stuff out of the way. So these are keyed to only go in a certain way usually, and it looks like that lines up pretty good right there. So it's important when you're installing one of these, if it's mounted at the bottom of the case, usually there's an intake fan that will suck air in, and that can cause problems if you plan on putting this on carpet, which I do. So I have a little stand that I always use on machines that are going to be mounted on carpet. Let's get the bottom one here first, because I can actually get that one. Come on. And I can't really reach the power supply from the back here, so I'm just kind of trying to reach in here. You never want to do all of the screws at once, because it can make it impossible to get the last holes lined up. So you get them all tightened, just like so they're in a few threads, and then once you get the fourth one in, you can really drive it home here. And we're not trying to kill this thing. It's not like a watertight seal or anything like that. We're just trying to tighten it to the point where it will be able to support its own weight, pretty much is the idea. Alright, so that's good and secured. Now we can flip this back around. Now the 24 pin connector here goes here, and then the CPU connector goes up there. So we just shove both of these through this here grommet. A 24 pin can actually probably just come through there. I think I'm going to do it from here. Now this plastic tab always goes towards the outside of the motherboard, wherever it is, whether it's at the top or the bottom or whatever. So you just press that in. Sometimes they click, sometimes they don't. That one didn't really click, but just give it a little pull to see if it's connected. And then our CPU can just come in up here, and so those are our connections for the motherboard power. And actually that is better if it goes through here, isn't it? Alright, so that takes care of those connections. Now we need to get our cables for the drive. So these should be labeled. Looks like these ones are SATA. I don't know how many options they give us here, really. It doesn't look like that many. So we're not going to be using this one. This one is just for basically video cards. It looks like this one has a couple SATA connectors and a video card connector. And then same, that actually looks like they all do. So we need 6 SATA connectors for this. So it looks like we'll have to do with this only gives us 5. So we'll use these 2 SATAs, and then we'll use this Molex as well. I have some Molex SATA to Molex connectors, so we'll use some of those. So let's get started on that routing here. These are pretty simple. One end is shaped like this. It just goes wherever it goes down there. Alright, so this is the old FreeNAS system that I had. I'm doing post commentary right now because the audio kind of got messed up here, but I really don't like this case. It's horribly ugly. I bought this case a long time ago when I was much younger. It seemed cool then, but I don't like it anymore, so it got relegated to just being a server, and now it's not even going to be that. It's going to get off recycled probably. So the cheap Cooler Master power supply that's in there is actually probably going to have to be switched over to the other machine, at least temporarily, because I don't actually like how the modular one's working out. But this board it got a Core i5. It's really a lot more than what I needed for this. It's just what I had around as spare parts. So basically, I just have to pull the 6 drives out of here. One of these drives is questionable, but I'm just going to pull them all and move them over to the other system. Alright, so we're over at the other system. Going to be switching over the SATA cables now. And you can probably see down there in the bottom, I did put in a Cooler Master power supply in here because I wasn't happy with the other power supply. I'm going to end up using that on another build in the future. I put a piece of blue tape on the questionable drive that needs to be replaced. As you see, all the drives have been moved over. They're all in their little drive caddies there. And I just put the piece of blue tape there so I could remember which one was the one that needs to be swapped out soon. Next time I open it up, I won't have to go fishing around. But I like how all the drives fit in there. It seems like it's a pretty good system, and I think this is going to work out a lot better than my previous system. Also use less power too, which is good. Alright, so everything's installed now. We got the Intel card in there. All the SATA cables are in. The kind of just a mess of cables. I'm going to tidy them up a little bit, make it a little bit neater. I don't really ever go crazy with the cable management because stuff's going to get swapped out at some point. I put the USB port that usually goes on the front of a case. I actually pulled the header off, and I'm using that to put the thumb drive for the FreeNAS installation inside, so that it won't be hanging out the back or anything. But that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this build, and we'll do the software configuration later. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.